On a quiet evening in a small-town parking lot, one officer's routine patrol would lead to an encounter that would change everything. A woman, casually leaning on her car, her phone in hand, seemed out of place, but not for any reason she could control. Officer Mark Davis, known for his rigid enforcement, saw something he didn't like, a flicker of suspicion. And so, he approached. What followed was a moment that would test not just the law, but everything this officer believed about himself. He didn't know it yet, but in those next few seconds, his career, his reputation, and the truth itself were about to collide. The woman he chose to question wasn't just a civilian. She was someone far more than he ever expected, someone who would force him to confront his own biases in the most humbling way possible. But what happens when the person in power realizes they've made a critical mistake? And what if that mistake had a far-reaching cost, one that would ignite a conversation much bigger than a simple traffic stop? Officer Mark Davis had built his entire career around one guiding principle: order. Every action he took, every decision he made, was in the name of keeping his town safe. He was known for his precision, his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement, and the way he could spot trouble from a mile away. It was a reputation he wore proudly. But beneath the surface, there was something darker, something that had been there for years, something he refused to acknowledge. Davis never saw himself as biased. To him, the rules were simple, black and white. He was the one who kept things in line, who ensured that the law was respected. And if people didn't like his methods, well, that was their problem. But there was a problem, a blind spot in his judgment, a bias that crept in without him realizing it, particularly when it came to people of color. He'd convinced himself that it was all about maintaining order, but his actions often said otherwise. His assumptions ran deep, clouding his perception, making it easier to dismiss people who didn't fit the mold he expected. It wasn't malicious, it was just the way he operated. And that night, as he watched Rachel King from across the parking lot, his bias would guide him once again, pushing him to make a choice he would soon regret. Enter Rachel King. She sat on the hood of her car, her legs crossed, a smile on her face as she chatted casually on the phone. The evening sun cast a golden glow on her, yet there was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that would suggest she was anything but an ordinary person in an ordinary place. But something about her felt out of place, an odd serenity that didn't fit the atmosphere of the parking lot, where the hum of late shoppers and the creak of distant carts filled the air. To anyone else, she might have seemed like just another passerby, waiting for someone, lost in conversation. But to Officer Davis, she was the perfect picture of someone who had something to hide. Why was she so calm? What was she doing there, sitting alone on a quiet evening, unbothered by the fading daylight? Officer Davis's mind began to race, each passing moment deepening his suspicion. He had seen this before, the quiet, unassuming behavior that could easily mask something far more sinister. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for something, or someone. He had to act. She was lingering too long, and in his mind that alone was reason enough to investigate. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he made the decision to approach. His presence was firm, deliberate. There was no room for doubt, not for him, not tonight. With every step Officer Davis took toward Rachel, the distance between them seemed to grow wider, though they were standing just feet apart. His movements were deliberate, each one a signal of authority, his posture stiff and unyielding. His uniform, pressed and perfect, was a symbol of his role, but also his power, a power he was ready to exercise without hesitation. His jaw clenched as he neared her, eyes narrowing, his mind already set on the confrontation he believed was necessary. Rachel, still sitting on the hood of her car, noticed him but didn't flinch. Her hand remained steady on the phone, a calm smile still on her lips as she finished her conversation. She didn't seem concerned. In fact, she didn't seem to notice him at all, not as the looming figure he wanted to be. Officer Davis paused just a few feet away from her, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. His voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID," he demanded, his tone not leaving room for negotiation. It's standard procedure for anyone lingering on private property. Rachel's eyes briefly met his, but her expression remained unchanged. She slowly set her phone down, her calmness only fueling the officer's growing suspicion. She didn't reach for her ID, instead answering with the same composed voice. "I'm waiting for someone, officer. I'm not breaking any laws and I'm not required to show you my identification." Her words hung in the air, a subtle challenge to the officer's authority. Davis's grip on the situation began to slip as he absorbed her response. He was used to compliance, not resistance. And here she was, questioning his every assumption without so much as raising her voice. The tension thickened, the air around them growing heavier. Davis's patience wore thin. "You're refusing to cooperate," he snapped, his voice now cold with accusation. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for obstruction." The last word stung like a threat, carrying across the nearly empty parking lot, drawing the attention of a few late-night shoppers. Rachel's face, however, remained an enigma. She wasn't intimidated by his threats, and it was in that moment, with her unshaken demeanour, that the first crack appeared in Davis's confidence. She met his gaze again, neither challenging nor backing down, simply holding his eyes, as if daring him to escalate further. Davis could feel the judgment in her silence, the knowledge that she wasn't afraid of him. The more he demanded, the more he revealed his desperation, and yet Rachel stayed unruffled, still waiting for her companion. With Officer Davis standing there, growing more tense by the second, Rachel's movements were slow and deliberate. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing past a few items before they landed on her wallet. For a brief moment, Davis thought she might be reaching for something more, something to defend herself against him, perhaps, a weapon maybe. His hand instinctively hovered near his holster, his fingers ready to grip the handle of his gun. His eyes never left her, but his mind raced, calculating the next step. Was she about to make a move? But instead of pulling out a weapon, Rachel's hand emerged with a simple leather wallet, which she opened with the same calm precision she had displayed throughout the encounter. For a split second, Davis's breath caught in his chest, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure what to expect, but it certainly wasn't what came next. What Rachel pulled from her wallet wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a piece of evidence to incriminate her. It was a badge, a gleaming badge. The polished metal caught the last sliver of sunlight, almost like a spotlight cutting through the growing shadows. The words, "Federal Bureau of Investigation," shone brightly, and for a long, disorienting moment, Davis could do nothing but stare at it. The letters seemed to mock him, standing out in stark contrast to his own arrogance and certainty. Rachel's face, usually so composed, now carried an unmistakable weight, a commanding presence that transformed her demeanour in an instant. She wasn't just any civilian. She was someone with authority. Her voice, though calm, was steady and clear as she introduced herself. "I'm Special Agent Rachel King," she said, each word punctuated with the weight of her position. Davis felt a rush of heat spread across his face as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The shock coursed through him, cold and hard, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had judged her, assumed things about her, and all the while she was an agent of the very law he claimed to uphold. How could he have missed it? How could he have failed to see what was right in front of him? Rachel stood there, the badge still gleaming in the fading light, its presence hanging between them like a challenge. Her posture remained composed, but now there was an undeniable authority in the way she carried herself. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. As Officer Davis stammered, his hand still hovering near his gun, she met his gaze, unwavering. Her words came slowly, each one deliberate, as if they carried the weight of the entire situation. "This isn't just about you breaking procedure, officer," Rachel said, her voice steady, but edged with the sharpness of a woman who had seen this all before. "It's about the bigger issue, the assumptions we make before we even know the facts, the biases we carry without even realizing it. You assumed I was a threat simply because of the color of my skin. You didn't give me a chance. You never considered that I might be someone you'd least expect." Davis felt his throat tighten as her words hit him like a slap. They were simple, but they echoed in his ears, and for the first time, he couldn't ignore the truth of them. His own assumptions had led him here, to this moment of humiliation and regret. He had been so quick to judge, so ready to prove himself right, without considering the consequences of his actions. Davis took a step forward, his voice shaking as he tried to justify his behavior. "I was just doing my job," he said, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I had to check. I've seen things before, and I thought I—" His words faltered, swallowed by the realization of how flimsy his excuses sounded. Rachel didn't flinch at his attempt to defend himself. She'd heard it all before, the empty justifications, the denials, the claims that it was all part of keeping order, but she wasn't buying it. "You're not just doing your job, officer," she responded, her eyes cold now, focused. "You were policing based on your own biases, not the law. And that's where we've gone wrong." Without another word, Rachel pulled out her phone and dialed the number she knew all too well. The call was brief, but its impact would be far-reaching. As she spoke with calm precision, she informed Davis's department about the incident. She didn't shout. She didn't make threats. She simply reported what had happened, knowing full well that the consequences for Davis would be swift and severe. Davis stood frozen, his body betraying him as he watched Rachel end the call. The damage was done. He could feel it. The cold sweat at the back of his neck, the gnawing pit in his stomach. He had crossed a line, and now there would be no hiding from the truth. His actions were no longer just a mistake. They were a reckoning. As Rachel calmly drove away, leaving Officer Davis standing in the parking lot, the finality of the moment hit him like a tidal wave. His chest felt tight, his thoughts scattered. For the first time, he felt small, no longer the commanding officer he had been just minutes ago. His posture slumped, and he stared at the ground, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. The very man who prided himself on upholding order, on maintaining control, now stood in the wake of his own humbling moment. He had been caught in his own prejudice, caught in his assumption that his version of justice was the only one that mattered. Within hours of Rachel's call to his department, Davis's fate was sealed. His superiors had received the report, and they wasted no time in launching an investigation into his actions. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him as the department began to dig into what had happened. The quiet whispers, the cold stares. It was all too much. The walls seemed to close in, each step he took heavier than the last. Then came the news. Davis was suspended without pay, effective immediately. The notification hit him like a punch to the gut. No longer would he be the officer in charge. No longer would he have the authority he'd taken for granted. The decision sent ripples through the department, and it was a blow not only to Davis, but to the very reputation he'd worked so hard to build. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. Outside the walls of the department, the story was spreading fast. News outlets picked up the story, turning it into a firestorm. Cameras flashed as reporters questioned the nature of the incident, and community leaders weighed in with strong words. The public's reaction was swift and harsh. People were angry, not just at the officer, but at the system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. Calls for change echoed in the streets, online forums, and across television screens. Activists, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens condemned Davis's actions, demanding reforms to address racial bias in policing. His actions, once isolated and personal, had become a symbol of a much larger issue, an issue that had festered beneath the surface for too long. In the midst of this uproar, the conversation turned toward the broader issue of policing. especially in marginalized communities. It wasn't just about Officer Davis anymore. It was about the way people of color had been treated by the system, the way their very presence had been seen as a threat by those sworn to protect them. People began to ask questions. What kind of justice was being served when biases like Davis's could guide an officer's actions without consequence? What did it say about the integrity of law enforcement when assumptions trumped facts and when the law was applied unevenly? The public response was overwhelming. Calls for increased oversight, better training programs, and mandatory bias awareness became the rallying cries of those seeking change. As the spotlight turned on Davis, it wasn't just his career on the line. It was the credibility of the entire department, and the urgency of the need for reform had never been clearer. With the weight of his badge temporarily lifted, Officer Davis found himself in a world without his usual authority. He had been suspended without pay, but what he hadn't expected was the silence that followed. For the first time, he had no duties to uphold, no cases to solve, no streets to patrol. All he had was time to reflect on everything that had led him to this point. The days stretched before him, long and quiet, filled with the gnawing realization that he had failed, not just as an officer, but as a person who believed he was beyond reproach. Davis spent those weeks in a haze of self-reflection. He attended seminars on racial bias, sitting quietly in rooms filled with uncomfortable truths, the weight of each word sinking deeper into his conscience. He listened as experts explained the historical context of policing in marginalized communities, the systemic issues that perpetuated injustice, and he began to understand how deep the problem ran. He thought about Rachel King, the calm way she had stood up to him. She hadn't been just a symbol of authority. She had been a mirror, forcing him to look at himself in ways he never had before. He began to speak with community leaders, some of whom had been at the forefront of calling for change. Their words weren't just criticisms, they were invitations to understand, to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the very people they were sworn to protect. Through those conversations, Davis heard stories of fear, of mistrust, of encounters just like his own, only they hadn't ended with an officer facing accountability. These were stories of routine abuse, of silent suffering at the hands of people like him, and it hit him harder than any disciplinary action could. His own actions had been part of that same broken system, perpetuating the cycle. For the first time, Davis saw the mistrust in the community with new eyes. He no longer saw it as resistance or hostility. He saw it as a defense mechanism, a way for people to protect themselves from a system that had failed them time and again. He understood now why Rachel hadn't flinched under his scrutiny, because she had seen this all before, and she knew that the badge he wore didn't give him the power to make assumptions without consequences. The suspension, once a punishment in his eyes, became something else, a turning point. Davis had been given the rare opportunity to step back and see the world through the eyes of the people he had sworn to protect. It wasn't easy, it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. And slowly, painfully, he began to change. No longer did he see the law as a rigid set of rules. He began to see it as something that needed constant re-evaluation, as something that must be applied with empathy, with care, and with a deeper understanding of the people it was meant to serve. When Officer Davis returned to work after his suspension, it was clear that things could never go back to the way they were. The community, once wary and distrustful of the law, watched closely, waiting to see if the changes that had been promised would actually take place. The department, under the weight of public scrutiny, had no choice but to act. Davis's return wasn't just about reinstating him as an officer. It was about addressing the systemic problems that had been exposed by his actions. The first sign of change came swiftly. The department implemented mandatory bias training for all officers. It wasn't a suggestion or a one-time workshop. It was an ongoing initiative that was woven into the very fabric of the department. The goal wasn't just to educate, but to shift the culture from one that often overlooked its biases to one that actively worked to combat them. For Davis, the training was more than just a professional requirement. It was a personal commitment to never repeat the mistakes of his past. He threw himself into the sessions, engaging in uncomfortable discussions about race, privilege, and the historical tension between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Each day was a reminder of the long road ahead, but also a promise of change, one small step at a time. The community, once skeptical of any real reform, began to feel the ripple effects of this shift. The calls for change had come from activists, from leaders, and from everyday people who had been overlooked for far too long. And now, they were finally starting to see action. The same community that had once felt persecuted began to feel heard. Officers, once seen as adversaries, now became partners in the ongoing conversation about trust, justice, and accountability. Slowly, the walls that had divided the police force and the community began to crumble, replaced by a mutual understanding that was years in the making. As for Rachel King, she had become a symbol of justice in her own right. Her quiet, yet resolute stand against Officer Davis had sparked something much larger than one isolated incident. She didn't just expose the flaws of a single officer, she exposed the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester in law enforcement for years. Rachel's decision to stand up to Davis was more than an act of personal courage. It was a catalyst for change. She wasn't just an agent, she was a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. Her actions resonated far beyond that parking lot. The story of that night spread, not as a tale of a single officer's failure, but as a beacon for what could be accomplished when individuals, whether in uniform or not, stood firm in the face of injustice. Rachel's bravery became a symbol for those fighting for accountability in law enforcement, a reminder that real change often begins with a single powerful act of defiance against the status quo. This was more than just a confrontation in a parking lot. It was a catalyst for change. Officer Davis's story reminds us that real transformation doesn't come from punishing others. It begins with confronting our own biases and holding ourselves accountable. It's not always comfortable, but without that self-awareness and willingness to change, we can never move forward. Davis's journey, from his mistaken assumptions to his hard-earned reflection, shows us that redemption is possible, but only if we are open to learning from our mistakes and doing the difficult work to make things right. And the conversation doesn't end here. The changes sparked by that night's encounter didn't just affect Officer Davis. They reverberated throughout the community, igniting a broader movement that continues to fight for fairness, accountability, and equality within law enforcement. But we all have a role to play in making sure those changes stick. What do you think? Should Officer Davis have faced more severe consequences? Or do you think his suspension gave him a fair chance to change? Was his journey of reflection enough? Or is there more that needs to be done in cases like these? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about real change and justice. Share this video to keep the conversation going, because it's only by talking about these issues that we can continue to move forward and make a difference.